its welfare reform, and the religious community as the Texas State Legislature is about to make a critical decision. To learn more, stay with us on Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Welcome to this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson, the Communications Coordinator of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. And today we're turning our attention to a critical incident in regard to welfare reform. Recently enacted by Congress, the state of Texas now has to make its response in applying that to our region. And the fact of the matter is that there is a decision to be made soon as to where as much as $1/3 billion is to be spent in regard to people on welfare making the transition to independence and self-sufficiency. It seems like there may be a possibility of diverting what is earmarked for that purpose for other purposes. And the religious community is making a concerted response. And among those to take leadership in this are two folks who are with us today. We have Marcia Kinsey from the Center for Public Policy Priorities.
Good to be with you.
Benedictine Outreach, and we have Patrick Flood, the Executive Director of Austin Metropolitan Ministries.
Thank you, Richard.
We welcome you both. And let's turn to what has been very well publicized in regard to the reform of welfare, an act of Congress in 1996. Now it's coming to Texas. And the legislature, meeting as we speak, is having to make decisions as to implementing that locally and throughout the state. And as I understand it, there is a considerable sum of money that has been earmarked in terms of a block grant by the federal government to be used for helping people make that transition off of welfare. But that seems to be questionable, whether that's actually going to be done as intended. Is that a fair summary of the issue, Marcia?
That's absolutely. The issue really is that Texas is getting $393 million more dollars than it would have gotten under our current system to spend in this next 2 years. And Texas budget makers have to decide how they will distribute that money. Now, of course, when we get that money, the legislature has a choice. They can either really spend it on what Congress intended, or they can take money that they had been spending, state general revenue dollars, and divert and put those new federal block grant dollars in the place and divert that money out and spend the state money in other places.
Okay, now, how can the state legislature do this when the block grant says it's supposed to be used for training people in their jobs and otherwise getting off of welfare? How can they do that?
Well, it's fairly complex and it's hard to describe easily, but mainly what the legislature is doing is they're looking at places where they have been spending money as Congress asked them to. For example, in the state of Texas, the welfare block grant can actually be spent in child protective services. So they're taking some of their own dollars that they have spent in those places and putting federal dollars in place of those funds.
Oh, I see. It's almost, it sounds to me like a shell game. I mean, as far as what had been, could have been used for other purposes, using it for other purposes when it, do you agree with that analysis?
Yes,
Pat?
it is a shell game. That's a good description of it. There's an opportunity now to follow through on the intent of the federal law, which was to train people in job training for sustainable income, so that within the 5 years as they leave AFDC, which does not exist for welfare, now it's called TANF, they would have skills that would make them independent.
TANF,
TANF.
What does that mean?
It's Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It's the title for the new federal block grant, the new federal welfare block grant.
Okay. And to go back to what you said, this is substituting for what used to be like aid to dependent children.
Which was the welfare program. There isn't any more welfare program from the federal level. That is gone. That battle has been accomplished for those who wanted to take away welfare. But you have a block grant, a total amount of money that comes from the federal level to the state of Texas and to every other state that can be used for the intent of what the law was enacted to do. That is to bring people who are on welfare, and most of them on welfare, by the way, are children, so bring their parents who are on welfare to a job, not just to be placed, but to be able to sustain and be independent. Now that's the philosophy behind this. And if you play the shell game, there will not be financial resources focusing in on the welfare recipient to become independent, become able to support their family. There are other dimensions to it besides welfare as well, the legal immigrants and children, the impact of this on children. You know, there's a whole area that 393 million, if it's used correctly, within the next 2 years could greatly relieve and have input for years to come, you know, as a result.
Okay, now Pat was just saying there's more than just job training to help people who need to get equipped to move out and get into the workforce, and you mentioned legal
immigrants.
Yeah. Spell some more of that out for
It's
us.
probably good to back up and sort of talk about what Congress really did. Congress really did three things when they passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act.
Oh, that's what it was called.
That's what it's called. They, first of all, clearly wanted to save money. You'll remember that Congress, the 104th Congress, was when the Republicans took over Congress, and there had been the Contract with America and a long debate lasting a year and a half about how we were going to balance our federal budget and how we needed to cut welfare spending. Well, if you look back on what the 104th Congress did, the money they saved in entitlement programs, which are the ongoing guaranteed programs, mostly comes out of programs to low-income folks. 94% of the money does. So the first thing Congress did was save federal congressional money by cutting programs to low-income folks. The second thing Congress did was reform welfare, and I put that word in quotes because it means to take corrective action. And I'm not certain that I would say that Congress really reformed welfare. They certainly took steps. They wanted to spend less money on welfare, and they wanted to deal with an issue that I think that everyone feels like is an issue in this country, which is help families become more independent. Now, unfortunately, they didn't spend any new money to do that. They didn't give states new dollars earmarked specifically for job training, for example. They didn't talk about how states were to create jobs for folks if there weren't jobs. The third thing that Congress did was affect a lot of programs that have nothing to do with welfare, like, for example, the food stamp program, which is a public assistance program, but it affects many families who are working. It serves families much above...
People who aren't on welfare.
Yes, people who aren't on welfare.
Okay.
It made cuts to the food stamp program. It made cuts to programs serving legal immigrants in particular. It removed them, the majority of them, not all of them, from the Supplemental Security Income Program, which is a cash assistance program for poor elderly and disabled folks. It also removed them from the food stamp program. It made cuts to the Supplemental Security Income Program for disabled children. So there were a number of programs that have nothing to do with welfare programs that were also cut.
And this block grant, this $393 million, over a third of $1 billion, is supposed to be Texas's way of making sure these needs are met.
Yes.
That's correct.
And but what I'm hearing you say, if this is spent for this purpose, but then that comparable amount that the state was putting in before is then used to, say, have a property tax cut or whatever else the legislature decides to do with it, then the net result is a loss of support for these folks who are in that condition.
Right now, and we should note that this is April 10th when we're talking about this today, but right now both the House and the Senate are recommending removing about a third of that block grant to divert it to other places. So they're not recommending a net loss for low-income programs from the block grant. But the point you make is a great one, and that is that Congress cut programs in Texas more than $393 million. If you just look at the loss to Texas related to the benefit cut for legal immigrants, Texas will lose $500 million in the next 2 years. So it is definitely a net loss for Texas.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And that's a loss to the economy of Texas. I mean, it's a loss to Texas for illegal immigrants, or legal immigrants who need it. But they spend it. They spend all the money that they receive into the economy of Texas. So that's wiped away. In other words, there's been a significant impact on Texas. Right. And so this block grant can ameliorate some of the impact of that, but at the same time, it assists the economy of Texas to be able to
Okay.
give people spending dollars.
There is a economic factor involved
Yes.
that affects everybody to that extent. I have to tell you that overall, apart from some of the specifics of this, and sometimes to hear dollar figures too much is to make your eyes glaze over. The thing that strikes me is that it could be Robin Hood in reverse, where you take from the poor to give to the better off. And is that a misreading, or is I'm just giving you a feedback on that?
I would say that that particularly could be true in Texas, because one of the reasons why Texas is diverting this block grant is that the Texas legislature is considering giving back $1 billion surplus to property tax relief. And certainly that will benefit rich people much more than it will benefit poor people. So I think that's probably a fairly accurate statement. It remains to be seen if that $1 billion will really be given back.
In relationship to that, and I know dollars get eyes glazed over, but there has been money set aside in the state legislature, $1 billion, I believe, in the Senate, or $1.5 billion in the Senate, $1 billion in the legislature, that could be used, designated for needs within the community without taking away from that $393 million. So what we're saying, it's really the very short-sighted and punitive act to do that against welfare recipients and against the intent of Congress.
Well,
But it may be legal. You know,
Yeah.
that's not the point.
yeah, it's not a matter of legality, it's a matter of morality, it sounds like. I think that one of the things, too, we want to do is to begin to focus in on why the religious community is exercised about this. This seems to be politics. This seems to be budgeting. You're connected to a Benedictine service. Pat, you're the director of an interfaith organization, and in the second half of the show, we'll be taking a break momentarily, but we'll focus upon that. But even now, let's just get a little bit of a sense of what you see as being the reason or the rationale for religious folks to be concerned about it. Why don't we have you make an initial response to that?
There's a tendency in this day and age with everything to polarize things. Either the government does it or the private sector does it. And really, it shouldn't be that. It should be mutual responsibility of all of us to do it, you see. And so that the government should not and cannot remove itself from this process. And secondly, from the religious community standpoint, the religious community has stepped up to the plate and hit, and it can do more. I mean, it's not a question of either or.
But to expect the churches or the congregations to pick up the needs of people on welfare and become the safety net is what you're saying is unrealistic.
It's impossible. The resources aren't there. It's another disingenuous thing to approach when the financial resources are not present within the churches to even do it.
Okay, well, one thing that is present is the break that's coming up on us quickly, so let's just pause here for a moment, and we'll be right back with our second half of Austin Faith Dialogue today. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today our subject is welfare reform in the state of Texas and how the religious community is trying to seek to make that a positive change. And we have with us on our program today Marcia Kinsey from the Center for Public Policy Priorities and Pat Flood from the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the first half, we were analyzing what it is that what you call the so-called welfare reform, but certain big welfare changes, and how the state legislature is confronting this issue at the very end of April, maybe early May at the latest, to decide whether, in effect, to do what the federal government says needs to be done in terms of applying $1/3 billion grant block to these purposes that we named earlier on. And we were beginning to get into the issue of why congregations should be concerned about this, and Pat gave an initial response. What's your thought about that, Marcia?
Well, I think Pat did a great job of talking about the fact that we do have to do this in communion with one another, both government and the private sector and churches.
In meeting these needs.
In meeting these needs. Definitely, we are hearing tales of churches having more people knock at their doors now that federal welfare legislation has passed. And particularly as the year progresses, and in August, for example, when legal immigrants lose their benefits, many of their benefits, we will probably see even more people knocking at the doors of churches. And so I think there's definitely a role both on the service sector side to meet the need if possible, or to at least help alleviate the need. There's also a role on the government side to at least inform our lawmakers about what is happening and tell them, particularly churches who do have service ministries, to tell their lawmakers about the effect of welfare reform on their ministries.
I mean, I was a pastor of a local church here for several years, downtown church, where people were coming in asking for assistance. And I can say firsthand on the basis of that what congregations are able to do is just a drop in the bucket compared to the ocean of need that is there, and that the government has taken responsibility for that by and large, the safety net as it's called. And now it seems like that is under profound change. I've heard you say, Pat, that all of a sudden people are showing up in churches more.
Well, just this week, a report from various congregations is that the requests for assistance has risen 30 to 40% in the last 2 weeks, last 3 weeks. In other words, what I'm saying is
This is since Easter.
Excuse me?
Since Easter.
Since Easter. And then there was another report since Christmas. You know, you get these various reports, and that was since Easter. The word is out in public policy areas and in agency areas and referral areas that the place to refer people for needs is the religious community. There has been a whole study done on the role of faith-based organizations and how do they respond from the private sector. That study was done with the state. The question is not to react negatively against that. I mean, there are certain questions that people will react to should the church, would separate the church and state, be involved in some of this. You're going to hear that from the Civil Liberties Union, American Civil Liberties Union, and other people. And all those questions will be discussed, but the point is that there's a tremendous pressure being placed on the congregations right now in Austin, the parishes, and it's in the thousands of dollars. There are congregations, parishes that are paying up to $2,500 a month now, seeing 500 people a week. Major budget impacts. And of course, those parishes that have always done that, you know, I mean, has always responded, like the one you were talking about, are really getting a big increase on people calling in. I talked to one Presbyterian minister, and he said, well, we always had people coming in. He's at a church on the south side. But this was the first time I began to get people going through Yellow Pages and calling me. How did you get there? And he also said, I'm getting teachers from school calling about their children. So the churches are very much in the middle of this, the religious community, because they are becoming the safety net, or at least the first or second referral. So it's not emergency services we're providing. We're providing sustainable services and ongoing services. which is being asked for.
Well, one of the things, too, that I can't help but think about as we've talked about it, the effect of this Welfare Reform Act really hasn't kicked in yet. I mean, it's not until later in the year that you said that those who are legal immigrants are suddenly taken off of what they have been receiving. And it's, what is it, after 5 years, those who have been on aid to dependent children will have their benefits cut permanently. That hasn't even started yet, and yet the requests have started coming in already. How do you account for that?
I think it has kicked in some areas. There are people whose time clock began to tick if they went to the searching for a job, but it's going to be kicking in much more. But I think there's a somewhat, I don't want to overstate it, a frenzy out there that this is where you go now. This is the route you go to get relief. It's not the government anymore, it's the private sector. And that frenzy, in a way, is being fed also by governmental agencies who would talk about that it's the private sector that has to carry its level of responsibility.
Okay.
So the question is not that we shouldn't, and not that we won't, it can't do more. Is it good, sound public policy to be able to respond? And Texas is in a very good state, by the way, economically. I mean, we're at a low unemployment rate, and we're flourishing. What will happen if there's a dip? You know, if we're having problems right now, and there's a dip, it's going to be worse.
Well, and we've had on the program before persons from Texas Impact. I recall they're saying that even though we're one of the wealthiest states in the nation, we're right down at the bottom as far as human services, just maybe above Mississippi. I mean,
Usually somewhere in that area.
Yeah, 42nd, 43rd, yeah.
I'm
level of
especially
provision.
wondering about the children. I mean, wonder if these parents can't find jobs. Wonder if the jobs aren't there and they're cut off from food stamps and they're cut off from the support that they received before. I mean, is it possible that we may be witness to a massive child sacrifice in this country?
There was a study done in California. California, starting in 1992, I believe, began cutting their AFDC rates, their AFDC benefit levels. And I'm not going to get this right, which is unfortunate for TV, but the first cut they made was somewhere in the area of 10%, and they saw a 20% increase in the reports of child abuse in that same year. So I think that we do need to look at what's going to happen to the children, and we do need to think about the unintended consequences of this legislation. What will be the impact on homelessness? What about substance abuse? As families become more desperate, what will they turn to when there is no longer a safety net for them?
Child Protective Services, what about battered children? I mean, it's all in there, you know.
What we ought to do is have a program on this same subject a year from now, because by that time
Maybe 6 months, I think we're...
we'll begin to see whether this is just you know, an alarmist view of the consequences, and the extent to which the public policy is now toward self-sufficiency in a way that it has never been before. And we can all say self-sufficiency is great, but especially if the jobs aren't there and the daycare isn't there. I mean, if I think of single parents who are supposed to go out and leave their children, but if they don't have sufficient funds or they're not sufficient facilities to leave the children with, then we compound the problem from that end.
It's a terrible thing if there isn't enough money for job training, but there is enough money for job placement, and then there are certain jobs that one can go to with a limited education and realize that they're going to lose that job within 6 months, to take them off of welfare sustenance, and then they're gone forever. I mean, that's a terrible ruse for us to play on our children. In a sense, it's, now if it's true, I mean, it's good for us to look at that 6 months from now or a year from now. But if there is that impact, we're kind of living in the throwaway society. It just happens to be a throwaway child society, and that's not a good thing.
By the way, I suddenly realized I haven't asked for the screen that shows your name, your address, and your phone number, sort of thing, for the Public Policy Center, and there it is on Lydia Street and 320-0222. Now that's connected to the Benedictine order in some way. Give us a little bit of a sense of that.
The Center for Public Policy Priorities is one of the ministries of the Benedictine Resource Center, which was founded by a group of Benedictine sisters who are based in San Antonio and Bernie. We've been in existence since 1985 and originally worked on healthcare access issues, but have over the years really broadened our scope and now work on a range of public policy issues affecting low-income folks.
Now, if people watching this say, well, I don't want to just passively watch this show, but want to do something about it, they could call you and you could give them some direction on
Give them
that?
great ideas.
Tell us some of the ideas.
Certainly. Right now, there's because the Texas legislature is in session, there's a lot of opportunities for people who want to call their legislators and express their concern about money being diverted away from job training and focusing on activities that help welfare mothers become independent. So that's certainly an area if people want to call their legislators and talk about the need for keeping that funding in job training. There are a host of welfare-related bills up right now in the legislature for folks who want to understand that issue better and want to have an impact on that. There are too many to list right now, but there are ones that would do away with welfare as a cash program entirely and instead give families vouchers to Walmart, for example, which you can imagine how limiting that would be, particularly in rural areas. There is an initiative to have a family cap, which would limit the number of children for whom a mom could get welfare benefits. So there's tons of issues if people are interested in knowing more about them.
Did you want to add to what people can do, Pat? What are you
I
encouraging
think
folks
something
to?
I'd like to add too is that the counties of Texas have the state law, a requirement to care for the indigent. You see, if money is not given and there's a rapid increase of poor people, they're going to be knocking at the doors of the counties. And so it's a very immediate question for the county commissioners, for taxpayers, who are going to, and how well they'll be able to respond. They'll have to respond in some way, maybe not totally, but there's going to be an increase. So what we can do right now is to call the state legislators, what do we call it? What committee is it?
It's the Budget Conference Committee that is the one that's making the decisions about the budget side, but then both in the House Human Services and the Senate Health and Human Services committees.
And you could call the Capitol and find out who's the head of those committees and just make calls. It's a great learning process for people.
Yeah.
And they ought to do it.
Well, this, because the legislature doesn't meet any longer than it does, this is the time to act.
Right
and,
now.
I would say the decision by the time this program airs is close to being done, but it's not too late for people
No,
to make an
absolutely
input.
not.
It is too late for us, however, to do anything but for me to thank you, Marcia Kinsey, for being here, and Patrick Flood for coming back, and for you folks for joining us on this particular Sunday. And just to recall the words of Jeremiah, who said that seek the welfare of the city, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And with that broader and deeper sense of what welfare means, we bid you peace here on Austin Faith Dialogue. Join us again next week for our next issue and episode, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.